A couple more people. Okay, so this evening we have the great guest, Jeffrey Mishlove, PhD. He's author of The Roots of Consciousness, Psi Development Systems, and PK Man. He's also the recipient of the only doctoral diploma in parapsychology ever awarded by an accredited university. And between the years 1986 and 2002, he hosted and co-produced the original Thinking Aloud public TV series, and he is also past president of the Intuition Network. I'm a great fan of his work. I've been watching his videos for quite a few years now, I think about 6 years on YouTube. He has a great YouTube channel called New Thinking Aloud. Hundreds of video interviews on there. I know a lot of you here have seen a lot of those already, but if you haven't, we'll put the link in the chat channel as well, and you can go and have a look at that there. So yeah, welcome Jeffrey, and thanks for agreeing to come along this evening and chat to all these interested people.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm not exactly sure what the format is and what your backgrounds are. Maybe, Daz, I could ask you a couple of questions to help orient me
Yes.
as to what the expectations are and who I'm with, how experienced is the group, and so on.
I can give you a quick overview now. Most of us here are practicing remote viewers on one level or another, using a multitude of disciplines. We also all connect through various platforms on the internet, including Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, and Discord. We're at various levels. Some of the people here I recognize that I work with on a working level, doing remote viewing for paid work. A lot of the people here are just working as well on learning the skill from scratch, and they're essentially making their first steps into projects like ARV and predictions. Yeah, so it's just a broad swathe of people interested in all types of intuition and psychic-based services, but mainly remote viewing.
Oh, okay, well, so I guess perhaps I can talk for, about 15, 20 minutes and then field questions?
Yeah, or we can just go straight into questions and have a we kind of add, we go with the flow on these kind of things. Really, it depends on how you want to work as a person. If you want to go first and then we can ask questions, that would be great.
Oh, all right, let me just say a few things.
Yes.
I'll try to keep it relatively short. I was first exposed to remote viewing as early as 1973. At the time, I was a graduate student studying parapsychology in Berkeley, and I was living in a very unusual circumstance at a place called the Institute for the Study of Consciousness, which was set up in Berkeley by Arthur M. Young, who was the founder of the Institute and the inventor of the Bell helicopter, which was the first commercially licensed helicopter in 1947. It's the helicopter with the little glass bubble in front and two skids that it lands on. And Hale Puthoff came to speak at the Institute. Turns out that Arthur Young was actually at that time financing the research at SRI that was going on with Uri Geller. And excuse me, Puthoff began describing the work of remote viewing, and he invited me to come and see for myself at SRI. I didn't actually get there for a few years. I think it was 1976 when I actually showed up at SRI, and right away it was a wonderful experience. They've been very successful, at remote viewing, and I have to say, being in a well-funded, luxurious military-industrial think tank helps, because the environment at that time was such that as soon as you walk into the place, you get the feeling these are serious people. These are not hippies, because that was the hippie era. And they began by inviting me to join them for lunch in the cafeteria, which was definitely an upscale cafeteria, much better than the sort of food normally served to college students. And afterwards, they took me up to their laboratory. They showed me their shielded room that with walls 6 inches thick, so no radio signals could penetrate inside the room, which, aside from the fact that it prevents cheating, I think creates a great environment for remote viewing, because you don't have any subtle electromagnetic signals passing through your brain, as we all do most of the time if we're not in sort of a shielded environment. And I tend to think that just the electronic noise in the environment creates well, it interferes, I think, in a subtle way with the signal to noise ratio for remote viewing. So basically, they said to me, there's nothing to this. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. You don't need any special preparation. You don't need any training. Everybody who comes to this lab does extremely well. And all we want you to do is go into the closed room. They had a researcher there, Elizabeth Rauscher, who was also a good friend of mine, physicist. And she's going to go off to a distant location, and we're going to ask you to describe where she is. And so she went off. I went into the sealed room with Russell Targ, who was my monitor. We chatted for a while. Then Russell simply said to me, ask your subconscious mind to give you permission to receive information about where Elizabeth is and what she's doing. And I began describing this. Now, actually, if you go to the New Thinking Aloud channel, there is an interview that was made about 5 years ago with Elizabeth, because she remembered that event very well. It was one of her first remote viewing trials also. And what happened was this. I saw in my mind's eye what I interpreted to be a rack of clothing. So I said, well, we must be in Macy's. And I'm looking at a rack of clothing at the clothing store. And Russell said to me, don't worry about your interpretation, just draw what you see. And which I did. The target, it turns out, it's a target you may be familiar with, because Puthoff and Targ have used, it's part of their regular target pool and has been used on other occasions. For example, with Hella Hamid, it's the highway overpass that goes over Highway 101. The picture I drew, which I interpreted as a rack of clothing, was a perfect description, almost photographic. You could place it right over the photograph of the highway overpass, but I didn't, in my intellect, didn't see it as that. Nevertheless, when Elizabeth came back and was asked to match it with my transcript with the picture, with a target pool, she had no problem. It was, as far as they were concerned, it was a direct hit, although it was never part of the official published remote viewing studies at SRI. It was just considered a simple trial. But so the lesson to me right off the bat was, this stuff works without any effort. I figured you don't need any training, you just do it. And that was fine. Now, later on, I realized that what happens to people, in my experience, because I began leading workshops and training people to do remote viewing, and in my experience, I found pretty consistently what I think of as a beginner's luck effect. People, their very first time, often get amazingly good direct hits, but it's after that that it begins to sink in, like, oh my God, what have I done? And all sorts of, I think of them largely as emotional issues get in the way. So there's a real big difference between being able to perform remote viewing as a professional over and over again on an ongoing basis for clients or for yourself, as opposed to proving to yourself that this stuff can work. And in my case, I learned right off the bat, I can do it, and I can show other people how to do it the first time very easily. But I didn't take it further than that, really. I never went through all of the extensive training programs. Well, actually, that's not true. I've done programs with Lynn Buchanan and Joe McMoneagle and Marty Rosenblatt and so on over the years, but never really in a sustained, systematic way. The way that if you talk to trainers today like Laurie Williams, who I assume many of you will know, when she describes, the hard work that goes into becoming a professional remote viewer, I never went that far with it. And I think personally, the important thing for each of you or for anybody is this: when you're entering into this realm of psychic and spiritual functioning, the important thing for each individual, the way I like to phrase it, is to become the best version of yourself. And for some of you, that's going to mean being a professional remote viewer. In my case, it took me in different directions, and I'm very happy with those directions. I'm under the impression that the way the universe works ultimately is that when you are working to become the best version of yourself, which is going to be different for every person, the universe will help you. And it could be by giving you accurate information about a remote viewing target. It could be through synchronicities or dreams. I've had many dreams and synchronicities that have guided my career along the way in uncanny ways. So that's basically my message. And I'll stop here. And I'm happy to just field whatever questions you have. I like to tell people, give me your hardest questions.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I think you answered some of mine straight off the bat there, but I just want to share something with you. That very same overpass that you looked at, it's famously recorded by Hella Hamid as well. And I interviewed Lance Mungia recently, who did the documentary Third Eye Spies. Because I heard him on a radio interview 2 years ago talk about something specific. And essentially the story is that whilst they were making Third Eye Spies documentary, they unearthed that original audio footage of Hella talking about the overpass. And what they realized is that when she's going through the audio, it didn't exactly match the Outward Bounder person who was there at the time, which was Hal Puthoff. What they think now, because on the audio tape she's talking about someone that stumbles around and who's got a hunched position, and that they're trying to move around these stops in the middle of the path, which didn't exist when they did the experiment in the 70s, is that they're now thinking that she actually remote viewed when they were making the documentary a few years ago, and it was Russell Targ that was there. Because he's very blind and he was stumbling around, he was hunched, he was feeling a little bit ill that day and he was hunched up. So that's mind-boggling in itself, because it's many years after she died that apparently now she remote viewed that very same underpass.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, that is. Excellent, but we got loads of questions here, and someone you interviewed recently, John Knowles, is the first with his hand up here.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for that interview. I'll try to give you a hard question, too. You were asking me some questions that led to my basic beliefs, so I want to ask you that. But first, I wanted to ask you, because he gets a lot of flack. Ed May gets a lot of flack in the remote viewing community, and I'm a huge defender of Ed, even though he's a self-described curmudgeon. And I wondered what your estimate of him was. And then the other part of it was, do you think that the consciousness is the fundamental, like Marty Rosenblatt does? So that's two quick questions. Thank you.
Oh, okay, those are great questions, John. Thank you. Ed May is, I regard Ed as a good friend. I'm very fond of him. He's won awards for his contributions to parapsychology. He's made amazing contributions. I have nothing but praise for Ed May, but I do disagree with him about some points. He calls himself a physicalist, and he claims that he would give up his physicalist viewpoint if somebody could convince him of survival, life after death. I happen to think the evidence for survival is extremely strong. I think that Ed gives it short shrift, but I don't think that the evidence for survival is actually sufficient to overcome a physicalist or a materialist interpretation, because you could go this route, which was published, I think, in the 1880s by a couple of physicists, Guthrie and Tate, Scottish physicists, as I recall, in which they argue from the point of view of 19th century physics that all you need is higher dimensions of space, more dimensions of space than 3, which actually is very normal in physics these days. If you look at the work in superstring theory, people routinely talk about 11 or 12 dimensions. So if you're willing to add extra dimensions to the 4-dimensional space-time manifold we normally think of in conventional space, then you can accommodate even life after death within a physicalist framework. Nevertheless, there are real problems with physicalism, to my point of view, and materialism. Many people think of it as a philosophical dead end at this point in time. One of the problems simply is it doesn't account for consciousness adequately. And in fact, according to David Chalmers, you have what they call the hard problem of consciousness, which is you just can't get there using dead matter as the basis for it. Nobody has come up with a satisfactory explanation as to how consciousness would magically emerge from little dead billiard ball type particles bouncing around, or even waves and fields. So people who hold to the physicalist point of view basically say, don't worry about that, eventually we'll get there. There's also a problem with dualism, which many people subscribe to, including some great neurologists like Sir John Eccles and Wilder Penfield. The problem with dualism is, how do two metaphysical substances, mind and matter, that are completely distinct, interact with each other? And Ed May has been very vocal about that. He says it's hard enough for a neutrino, which is a physical particle, to interact with any other physical particle. A neutrino could pass right through the whole planet without any interactions at all. So considering that, how do you expect, if mind is a completely separate intellectual entity, how could it interact with matter? So I lean towards an idealistic metaphysics, metaphysical idealism, for that reason. I think logically, it eliminates the hard problem. It eliminates the problem of how mind and matter interact with each other. It's consistent with the perennial philosophy that's been described by people like Houston Smith and Aldous Huxley, that seems to be what mystics in every era and culture point towards and subscribe to. So I lean in that direction, but I have to admit, we don't have a final answer yet. And if it turns out that materialism is ultimately the best explanation, we'll have to expand what we mean by time and space and consciousness, but it could be done within a materialistic framework. My dissertation advisor when I was a graduate student at Berkeley was a philosopher named Michael Scriven, who was a materialist. as best I can tell, a pragmatic materialist. And he used to, very open to parapsychology. And he said that materialism it's like imperialism. It has an imperialistic hold on academia. And so that no matter what new challenges come up that challenge the materialistic paradigm, it will modify itself just enough to accommodate those challenges. And I expect you'll see that kind of a lot of creativity of that sort coming from materialists who say, all we have to do is tweak our understandings of time and space a little bit, and then everything will come together. But as I say, I think that metaphysical idealism, particularly as it's been espoused by Bernardo Kastrup, who in the last decade has written, I think, 11 or 12 books on the subject, is a very attractive point of view. It's, even though it goes against the grain of culture and logic, it's hard for most people to imagine that what we experience through our senses is, how can I put it? The way Bernardo would say it is that what we experience through the senses is so seductive that we take it to be the only reality. It's not the only reality at all. And Bernardo would say it's very real. He doesn't deny, as an idealist, the existence of the external world. He simply will tell you what we think of as matter is actually all made out of what you could call mentality or mind stuff.
Thanks for that very clear and detailed answer. We could talk about this for hours, I'm sure, but I will exit right now because it could go on for hours. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, guys, and thanks, John, for the question. David, you had your hand up next.
Hi, Jeff.
Hello.
You've explained a little bit in your opening words about why remote viewing has a bit of a special place in your heart. But with New Thinking Aloud, you've interviewed people from a very broad range of, I suppose you could say, more subjective disciplines where there isn't the blinding and the scientific approach to Psi that you have in RV. So I wonder, what do you think we can learn as individuals trying to discern, the aspects of existence which are outside of the immediate physical world? What can we learn from remote viewing that we can't learn from those perhaps more subjective modalities?
Well, remote viewing, as I understand it, and you probably have experiences that I don't even know about and have never heard of, taking remote viewing in different directions. But basically, I think of it as falling within the scientific paradigm. You're looking for proof, although proof is really not quite the right word either, because as my friend Stan Krippner says, proof exists in alcohol and in mathematics. It doesn't really exist in science. So what you're really looking for is evidence, not proof. But in any case, following the scientific method, as we see all around us in our culture, we are able to get a much better handle on the facts than you can otherwise. Now, I happen to think that a lot of work in remote viewing is not scientific at all. I, for example, interviewed several interviews, and I'm sure many of you know Angela Thompson-Smith, one of the founders of the International Remote Viewing Association, has published a book co-published with Scott Jones, as I recall, on her remote viewing of maybe 20 or 30 different alien species. And I've also talked to her about her remote viewing in ancient Atlantis. And I don't regard that work as scientific. I regard it more in what you described as a intuitive approach, because there's no possibility, at least in the current era, of getting empirical feedback. And empirical feedback in science, as it's normally thought of, means through the five senses, ultimately. So if Angela, does remote viewing with a conventional target, you can compare her viewing with sensory experience of the same target. However, it actually gets much more complex, because William James, the great founder of American psychology, a great contributor to psychical research, his final contribution was an essay in which he called radical empiricism. And by radical empiricism, what William James basically said is that the most direct experience that every person has is not through the senses. The most direct experience is our own consciousness. It's through our own consciousness that we then interpret what we experience through the senses. So it's even more direct than sensory experience, and therefore the experiences that we have directly through our consciousness should be considered empirical and should not be thrown out and excluded from science. So that opens a big door. But then the problem is, how do you distinguish? Let's take Angela Smith's remote viewing of aliens as an example. How do you distinguish those remote viewings from what might otherwise simply be considered a question of creative fantasy? And conventional empirical methods allow you to do that. But if you want to view targets that are not amenable to verification using the five senses, then you've got to engage yourself in what William James calls radical empiricism, which he believes should be incorporated into the scientific method. And he wrote about that over 110 years ago. The problem is 110 years later, we're still developing the tools to do that. So in Angela's case, she says, I place a high confidence on my remote viewings of alien entities and on personalities who lived in ancient Atlantis, because I'm an experienced remote viewer and I have an appreciation for the way things feel when they register in my consciousness. And when I had the remote viewing encounters with alien entities, it had a certain feeling to it that I attribute to reality. It's different than when I have a fantasy. And it's at that level there, which has to do with a faculty that in religious terms would be called discernment. Ultimately, I'm not a Christian myself, but it comes up in the Christian literature. How do you tell a real prophet from a false prophet? And the answer is you have to develop the ability to discern the difference. And how do you develop that ability? That ability is developed inwardly through your own conscious evolution. It's not an ability that is easily trained, I suppose, or that is amenable to the conventional scientific method. But this ability of discernment seems very, very important in remote viewing work and in life in general. Frankly, there are too many situations that we all have to confront on a day-to-day basis for which we simply can't rely on the scientific method. It's too inconvenient and oftentimes simply not possible, even if we had the resources. So ultimately, cultivating this very elusive quality known as discernment is what's going to make the difference between, I think, a successful remote viewer and one who is displacing, for example, or is having trouble in other regards.
Thank you. That's an absolutely wonderful answer. I was tasked to remote view the next landing of an astronaut on planet Mars a little while ago. And the session went quite normally. It was read, it was extremely boring. And then it got very weird. And I described a Stargate, just like the TV show. And speaking of discernment, I don't buy my session. I don't believe that, you know, but there is some factor out there which introduces noise and fantasy and weirdness alongside the feedbackable physical ground truth.
There's a lot of interesting work in Jungian psychology, in ancient Sufi philosophy as well, about the distinction between what they refer to as the imaginary versus the imaginal. And the imaginary, I think we understand that, creative fantasy, which is a natural human ability. Everybody can do that. And it's a very important ability as well. That's the basis of great literature and art and many creative inventions. But the imaginal is a realm that's very real. The philosopher Henri Corbin has written about it in great depth based on his studies of I believe it was a 10th century Sufi master named Suravardi. And he believed that Suravardi from the other plane actually initiated him into Sufism, and that it wasn't his imagination, that it was very real. And I've talked to many people, shamanistic practitioners of various stripes as well, who tell me how they engage with spiritual entities who are real, and that they are able to make a distinction between a real entity in the spirit world and one that is just concocted out of their imagination. But they would also tell you that to cultivate that distinction takes years of practice.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I'll let somebody else take a turn now. That was a wonderful answer.
Yeah, great question and answers there. Thanks for that, guys. Don, you had your hand up next.
Okay, let's see. So I was watching an interview you had with Ed May last night, and you said these words. You were talking about PSI mediated information. You're nodding your head. Okay, good.
The word is psi. It's not spelled out.
It's psi.
Yeah, but to call it PSI implies that it's an acronym of some sort, which it is not.
I always thought it was. Okay, so thank you. All right, so here we go. So these were the words you said to him. It's fair to say then that if there is an interface between the nervous system and the psi-mediated information, that interface may be receiving information from everywhere in space and time simultaneously. And the act of setting an intention reduces what the mind-brain processor is willing to accept. Very well chosen words. In fact, Ed complimented you on this and said you should write his what was it, his introduction or something like that. So okay, so if that is true, then all of us right now are exposed to the infinity of all time and space, and we're receiving information from everywhere simultaneously, right?
Yeah.
So why don't we realize that? That's my first question.
Oh, okay. Well, excuse me if I fumble around for a moment. I think the basic answer is biological. We are biological entities. We are part of what some people would call the great chain of being. We are mammals, we are primates. And if we look at other creatures, you'll see that their nervous systems are designed for survival. And our early ancestors were great at survival. Every living creature is here because they can survive, which means, for example, let's take a frog. We're not that different from frogs. We're vertebrates, just like the frogs are. A frog is very good at catching bugs. Their nervous system is designed so if they see something black flying around in front of them, their tongue will go right out, catch that fly, and they'll eat it. But their nervous system isn't good for many other things. You can take a frog as an example. You probably know this. It's a well-known example. Put the frog in a pot of water and put the water on the stove. As it heats up gradually, the frog's nervous system doesn't really detect the gradual warming of the water. So the frog, to my understanding, will stay there until the water is boiling and the frog is killed for that reason, because the nervous system of the frog was just not, that was never an issue that frogs had to deal with while they were evolving. And the same thing with our nervous system.
So
our brain, it's designed to give us the information that we need to get by in the physical world and no more, because we'd be overwhelmed.
So, right. So the overwhelming thing. All right. You know what an interference pattern is, right? You've got waves, they hit each other and they cancel parts, right? So if we're all being bombarded by all space and time, I'm just wondering if there could be some sort of interference pattern going on created by all of this information, the past, present, and future, all hitting us, coming in from all over the universe, creating a net zero effect, meaning we don't see it because it cancels it itself all out. What do you think of that?
I don't, well, I'd like to consider it, but my first thought is that it's probably not true. And the reason is you get the testimony of people who have the occasional experience called cosmic consciousness. There's a book by that title that was written by a psychiatrist back in the 1890s. His name is on the tip of my tongue, it'll come. But these people report being simultaneously aware of everything at once. It's a rare experience, it's a brief experience, but there are enough reports about it and in enough sufficient detail for me to give it credibility. And I think the way that it works, you see, is that the brain, which acts as a filter, the brain, the normal job of the brain is to keep you from being overwhelmed by all of that. But you can shut that function of the brain off. It's sometimes shut off through drugs. If you take psychedelic drugs, we now see it turns off areas of the brain rather than the researchers expected psychedelic drugs would enhance the functioning, the metabolic functioning of the brain, just the opposite. So by turning the brain off, consciousness itself can open up to this wider vista. People who have near-death experiences also report on occasion this experience of cosmic consciousness. So I'm inclined to think that that we're just unaware of it, not that they cancel out.
Okay, all right.
But I do think there are interference patterns that if we could see reality as it truly is, as William Blake, the poet, wrote, when the doors of perception are cleansed, we will see reality as it truly is, infinite.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for that, guys. Next up with their hand was Sasha.
Hi there. I want to follow up on what Don was saying about your interview with Ed May. You were talking about the models for this interface between, I guess, our conscious awareness and this information stream. And we were talking about it a little bit on Facebook. And I brought up this idea of the cocktail party effect. So if you're at a noisy party, there's a lot of noise, you're in a conversation with someone that you're engaged with, your brain will filter out all the noise from all the conversations going on around you so that you can pick up the conversation, that the speech from the person that you're attending to, and hear them very clearly, even though the person right behind you might be at the same distance from you and you're not hearing anything of what they're saying, unless they say your name. And all of a sudden, that information is processed, the meaning for it is processed, because there might be a concatenation of syllables from different conversations in the room that come up to make your name, but you don't hear that. That doesn't draw your attention. It's only when you hear someone who's saying your name and it's not an accidental putting together of those syllables. And so what that implies is that your brain is constantly processing for meaning, even at the most basic level. And when words, information, stimuli that's relevant to you come through that filtering process that is processing for meaning, then that's when, okay, that's brought to your conscious attention because it's marked as something that's relevant to you, because it's not just your name, it's also certain swear words having to do with sex. There's a whole category of things that will kind of push through that filter. And so I know that in psychology, they really wanted to think that your brain filters out noise, and then when it decides what's relevant sound in all the noise, then it applies the meaning filter. But they found that that's not the case, that when they tested it, they found no, we seem to be filtering, we seem to be processing meaning in all the information around us, and then filtering out anything that isn't important to us. And I'm wondering how that might apply to remote viewing, because it's a similar effect, whereas we think, okay, when I'm remote viewing, then I'm intending to pick up this other information that I normally filter out. The problem with that is sometimes you're not intending to remote view, but information that's meaningful to you does get through to your conscious awareness, right? If someone is in trouble and they kind of call out to you and you hear them, you give them a phone call to see what's wrong. So that does suggest that we're constantly processing or monitoring that information stream for information that's urgently relevant to us, right? And so I think, so I wanted kind of your thoughts on that, because that interview was 5 years ago. Has there been any progress in the last 5 years of researching that interface and trying to find not just this idea that there's an inhibitory response, but maybe that happens at a higher level, that first we're having to process meaning in that information stream, and then we're inhibiting everything that isn't important to us, right? So that we let through the information about our loved one in crisis. Does that make sense?
What an interesting question. Thank you for that. An exposition. Now you're referring to research that I'm not familiar with, and I don't really have the time or energy to keep up with research and brain studies and things like that. So that what you're saying is new to me, but here's what it does suggest. The idea is very interesting. I have heard this because I've heard various estimates that the brain has somewhere between, let's say, 1 billion and 100 billion neurons. And each neuron has as many as 10,000 axons and dendrites, all attached or to other neurons. So it's an incredible network. And in fact, what that means is that there are more neural pathways in a single human brain than there are subatomic particles in the entire known physical universe. Which suggests that possibly the brain is capable of doing what you're suggesting, scanning the entire universe for meaning. I doubt if most of us have that capacity, but maybe theoretically it is possible. But the truth is, to my knowledge, the kind of studies that would be necessary to really get at this, and especially as regards remote viewing information, have never been done. We're not even close to doing them. We don't have the resources have yet to be allocated. I look forward to the day when hundreds of colleges and universities across the world have departments of parapsychology that can do this kind of research, but that's probably well into the future.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Excellent questions again. Do you have anything else, Sasha, or should we move on to someone else?
No, you can move on. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks on that. Niam, you're up next then.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for coming out to do this. One of my favorite interviewees that you talked to is Stanley Krippner. The dream studies, and in particular, you did a talk about skepticism and like scoffing, kind of like the differences that come about with that. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, how do you see that affecting this? Like, you've been in this field for a while, do you think that whole conundrum has held us back? And kind of tying into that last comment you made on the last question, into the future, how do you see that affecting consciousness studies in general?
Well, I'm optimistic, and of course, society is always changing. It has always changed, and it will continue to change. Stanley Krippner is an amazing person. He just won an award. It was announced, I think, yesterday. He won the mentorship award from the Parapsychological Association. And he was extremely helpful to me. He inspired me to go into the field when I first heard him speak back in 1970. And he continues to constantly offer encouragement and help to, I think, probably hundreds, if not thousands of people today. With regard to the possibility of future studies in the field and overcoming the skepticism that holds things back. And the skeptics have been very ruthless and vicious about trying to thwart research in the field. I had skeptics who tried to pressure the University of California to withdraw my doctoral diploma in parapsychology after it had already been awarded. So I know firsthand the kind of underhanded things they're willing to do. Nevertheless, I think that they serve an important social function, skepticism of this sort, and that is that if society were all of a sudden, if we were to wake up tomorrow morning and discover, oh, everybody is telepathic, it would create, I suspect, enormous chaos. It has to happen gradually in order for it to be integrated into human culture. And it's not happening fast enough to suit me. But then again, I'm not the final judge of things. And I do think that eventually the skepticism is going to be worn down because the evidence isn't going away. And you can argue till the cows come home that this is impossible. It must be all sloppy thinking or fraud, but when the evidence keeps reaffirming itself over and over and over and over again, eventually the skepticism cannot be sustained, even though, over the short run, it can be. Just like Donald Trump these days has got more than 50% of the Republican Party convinced that he lost the last presidential election because of cheating, even though he wasn't able to sustain that argument in court. He lost 60 court cases, but his followers will still believe him. And the same is true with the people who believe the skeptics, who say it doesn't matter what evidence they claim because it's impossible. And so they must be wrong. Nevertheless, I think it's very significant that, for example, in the year 2018, 3 years ago, the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, which is typically an organization hostile to parapsychology, published a very important landmark article by Etzel Cardania, who at the time was the editor of the Journal of Parapsychology, reviewing the history of the field, covering meta-analyses that included over 1,400 different experiments, showing that they were well conducted, that even as the rigor of the experimental methodology increased, the results didn't drop off, and that the results are statistically overwhelming, astronomically significant when it comes to statistics. The skeptics responded basically by saying it doesn't matter how good the evidence is, we still won't believe it. But, that's an argument that any sophomore philosophy student can see through.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm in a similar opinion that the evidence just keeps piling up. So it's just keep pushing forward, basically.
My expectation is that it's going to take time. And one thing we don't know is how much time the human race has, because we're sort of on the precipice of all kinds of potential ways that we now have to exterminate ourselves. But if the human race does survive in another, it could be 50, it could be a few hundred or a few thousand years, sooner or later, the pendulum will change, and people who are engaged in remote viewing and parapsychology like yourselves will not be at the fringes of culture, you'll be at the center.
Thank you.
Thanks for those ones, guys. Up next is, I can't read the name there in its entirety, but I'll go with Erica.
Yeah, thank you. It is Erica. It's my previous Zoom name for some different, very serious meeting. Thank you very much for the comparison about the frog and how possibly our sensations are also limited, probably due to evolution. I mean, I love that comparison, and explained in very simple words, pretty complex thing. My question to you would be, from all the experiences and knowledge you have, how much do you think actually there's nurture, and how much do you think there's nature component in all of this? What if we had a small, young human being, let's say a child, and we would want to develop the capabilities instead of just killing them off, which kind of naturally happens once the kid starts to go to the kindergarten and then to the school and so forth. So how much do you think there's nurture? How much there's nature? And if you might have maybe some examples from real life, for example, like in Shaolin, like in China, I think it was in China, Shaolin monks, they've been specifically trained from age 6. So, I mean, they're developing their slightly different abilities, but what is your take on that? Thank you.
Excellent question once again. And I used to think nature nurture is probably 50-50. These days, I'm much more inclined to the nurture side. And the reason is because of some interviews I've done recently with Kenneth Pelletier, who's an old friend of mine, a person who has been involved in parapsychology a long time, but he's one of the pioneers in the field of, it's now called integrative medicine. It used to be called mind-body medicine and the like. But the topic we talked about is called epigenetics. It's a new field, it's maybe 20 years old. And the data of epigenetics shows that we are not limited by our genetic makeup. We can actually change our genes by changing what are called telomeres, that are certain molecules that attach themselves to genes and are responsible for whether the genes get turned on or turned off. And it now appears, based on all of this research in epigenetics, that what we used to think of as a scientific heresy called Lamarckian genetics is actually true. And Lamarck was a geneticist back at the I think in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who said that learned behavior gets passed on through the genes. Now, that now appears to be the case, which is why it's so important for each and every person to, as I say, become the best version of yourself, because that's what you can pass on. The genes that enabled you, the genetic makeup, including the epigenetic makeup that allowed you to become the best version of yourself in every way, in terms of your health, in terms of your relationships, in terms of your career. When you develop yourself that way, you can actually pass those genes on to your offspring. So that's an awful strong argument for the nurture side of the equation.
Thank you. I was expecting you would mention epigenetics. So yeah, that's pretty exciting, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, guys, on that one. And next up was Deborah.
Hi, Jeffrey. I've watched a lot of your shows and I really like what you're doing. I'm thinking of the shows that I watched with Adam Crabtree and how he talks about hypnagogia. And, you know, he actually works in Toronto where I live. I'm trying to get in contact with him, but, you know, he talks about this worm that he has had this relationship with. And I had this moth come up on my Facebook feed when I was learning about this. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And, so I want to get in touch with him, but what I'm wondering is how hypnagogia relates to the, say, imaginal versus the signal from RV. Like, how do you see that fitting in?
Yeah, hypnagogia is a wonderful word. It has to do with the state of consciousness that we all experience very briefly as we're falling asleep. It's sort of half awake, half asleep, and you're getting dream-like imagery, but you're still somewhat conscious, almost like lucid dreaming. And I think it's a very important state of consciousness. Adam Crabtree describes it beautifully in his book, Hypnagogia. And I did an interview not long ago with Gary Lockman, who is a historian of esoteric traditions. And he looked at, for example, Emanuel Swedenborg, an interesting person, a great scientist and engineer who wrote volumes about his communications with entities in the spirit world. And according to Adam Crabtree, it's because he had the rare ability to enter that hypnagogic state and to stay in it, which is something that can be cultivated. Now, it's even then, it's hard to distinguish between fantasy and the imaginal realities that exist. And not only is it hard to distinguish, but it's probably because that realm, the realm of mind stuff, or some people might call it, let's say, the astral plane, it doesn't operate by the same rules as the physical plane operates. It's much more flexible. And we have all sorts of creative capabilities, like in the Tibetan tradition, you can conjure up what they call a tulpa. It's a creature, you could say, created out of imagination, but then it takes on an autonomous, independent existence of its own. So what I'm saying is the boundaries between what we call the imaginal and what we call the imaginary, it's not as if there's a hard and fast boundary between them. But in any case, entering into the hypnagogic state, which is, I think, something that remote viewers are actually doing, although there's so many subtleties to these states of consciousness, whether you call it hypnagogia or guided meditation or relaxation, or as Carl Jung called it, creative visualization. We don't have yet an adequate map of all of these states of consciousness and what they're capable of doing. We're like the people who lived in the early 1400s, who had just the vaguest understanding that there were worlds out there past the Atlantic Ocean, that there are other continents that have yet to be explored.
Wow, that's wonderful. And I actually think John Vivenko describes seeing a tulpa in one of his RV sessions, guarding the site and not letting him in. And thank you so much for that, because I just, I guess it's a matter of discernment then too, to distinguish between a hypnagogic entity and something that's real. So that would be something to look out for in RV. And I don't think I've experienced anything hypnagogic yet, but I'm considering it as a total possibility because I have an imagination. So I want to be ready to discern, what I need to discern. So thank you, Jeffrey. It's really nice to meet you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Excellent questions and answers, guys. Thanks for those ones. And Don's come back with another one.
Okay. So Jeffrey, when I was at the IRVA conference, I had a talk with Tom McNear. We were talking about consciousness. And I told him that I believed, through my experience, what I perceived through remote viewing and through other experiences, that, everything seemed to have consciousness. And I think that fits under the Panpsychism description. There's consciousness in the walls and the tables and everything, really. And I asked him what his opinion was, and he said, well, I believe everything is consciousness. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around that. But then you just mentioned another one earlier, which was metaphysical idealism. Can you sort of differentiate a little bit some of these ideas?
I'll try. I'm not an expert, but panpsychism is a major philosophical viewpoint, and it does differ from metaphysical idealism in some subtle ways. And of course, it's tricky because when you get into the woods, you'll discover there are many different schools of metaphysical idealism and many different schools of thought of panpsychism. And there are other versions as well, like hylozoism, which is the opinion that everything is alive, very similar. So the idea of metaphysical idealism is that consciousness came first. At one time, there was nothing but consciousness. If you read the Rig Veda, there is a hymn a creation hymn. And it goes like, in the beginning, there was just one consciousness, and it got lonely. So out of desire, this one consciousness created the physical world. Or it's not so different from Genesis. God created the world. God said, let there be light, and there was light. Panpsychism is a little different. Panpsychism is the viewpoint that would say that every particle, every subatomic particle has a component of consciousness, that it's part of it. You could say that there's trying to think of the word some people use, like
it's integrated into it.
Let's suppose there's a consciousness particle, like we'll call it a mind-on, that every subatomic particle also has a mind-on with it, so that every little particle is also a conscious entity. It's both a physical entity and a conscious entity, whereas metaphysical idealism would say, yeah, it seems physical. We think of it as physical. It's a very seductive viewpoint, but it's really all consciousness. There's nothing but consciousness.
So metaphysical idealism is agreeing that everything is consciousness.
Yeah.
It is some sort of, what we perceive as hard walls and, desks and whatever is consciousness, right? I mean, I'm really having trouble wrapping my head around this, right?
You got to read several books by the proponents of each of these words to understand what they each mean by the word. So a panpsychist might say, for example, that a rock is conscious. Or they might say even a particle is conscious. That's different than saying that it's composed of mind stuff. It doesn't make it a conscious entity. Being a conscious entity is different than being composed of some kind of mental process.
Oh, I see the point. Okay, it's made of mind stuff is the idea. Okay.
And only mind stuff, that there's nothing else but mind stuff. Whereas a panpsychist might say, yeah, the physical world is real. It's really physical, but it also has a component. But, when you talk to panpsychists, their view is actually much more subtle than that. And Christian de Quincey is a panpsychist who I've interviewed. Philip Goff is a panpsychist whom I've interviewed. And if you get into the details of their philosophy, it's very different than the metaphysical idealism of Bernardo Castro.
So the idea here is panpsychists, including myself, believe that there is a physical thing and a mental thing, and somehow they come together. Whereas the metaphysical idealist, it's all consciousness to begin with. Nothing has to come together since it already is one thing already.
Yeah, that's my shorthand way of saying it, but I have a feeling that if you were to repeat that to anybody else, they would start arguing.
Okay. All right. Well, that's answered my basic question. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. John Knowles is back again.
Yeah, maybe to take a little break from all this philosophy and raise something that's rather delicate, but I really, esteem you, Jeff, and everything you do. And there's this issue of this Jason Georgiani that came up. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, but just briefly, Georgiani was invited to the APP conference. I met him. He was there. I don't know if he gave a talk or not. And there's some rather controversial aspects of Jason Georgiani. So I'd like, maybe Jeff, you could just explain that and where you come down on that, because I know people have not invited him back, and there's certain reasons they have for that. If you don't mind, if you don't want to talk about it.
He was invited to the applied precognition. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and he was there 2017 or 16, I forget which.
Oh, I recommended him.
Okay.
And he must have been there a year that I wasn't, because I don't remember him being there. I do remember recommending him at the time. I remember Marty Rosenblatt refusing to invite him because he said at the time Jason had already been slandered, or to be precise, libeled, for and accused of being a Nazi, basically. And I, at that time, didn't accept that. I've done 35 interviews with Jason, and they're among the most popular interviews on the New Thinking Aloud channel. And I considered him a controversial thinker, even a dangerous thinker, as he would like to characterize himself. But I basically thought of Jason as a humanist, maybe in the tradition of someone like Nietzsche, who was very critical of society. Now, subsequently, I've had a falling out with Jason, and it occurred because, first of all, I was trying to raise money for Jason because he was libeled and he lost his teaching job at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. So I was helping him out raising money, but then I saw that he had gone on YouTube and issued a, what can I call it? A declaration that we must destroy China. And I personally, a pacifist. I don't believe in war as a way to solve our problems. And Jason does. Well, and I've known that all along, but I didn't think he was going to go so far as to be what I have to characterize as a warmonger. So I called him on it, and I published a in presence monologue in which I said Jason's behavior is the epitome of warmongering, and I have to separate myself from it. But I, at that time, thought, well, fine. So he's my good friend. It's a difference of opinion. And Jason is welcome to come on New Thinking Aloud. We'll have an interesting discussion on whether or not war is a good thing for humanity. I'm quite comfortable defending the pacifist position, and I know he feels comfortable defending the other point of view. So, however, Jason took it as a slap in the face, and he immediately began launching personal attacks on me, unrelated to this controversy about war, and has broken off all communication with me since then. So as far as I'm concerned, Jason is well, I've had to take a second look. It's caused me to reevaluate my relationship with Jason, and to take a harder look at some of the things that he's been espousing since then. And in a way, at this point, I think he's doing me a big favor by cutting off all communication.
I'd like to add a little bit to that if I could, so that people are aware that Marty did in fact invite him. He did come and I met him, I met him when Steve Browdy was there, and talked, and he seemed very impressive, but then I learned more about his background. And the objection, which you didn't mention, was that he was associated with Richard Spencer for some time in terms of a very pro-Trump, very white supremacist approach. And that was one of the criticisms, that was the main criticism, as well as some anti-Semitism, as you are no doubt familiar with. So I think people need to know that. And I hadn't heard about this latest developments. Thank you for clarifying that. And it's unfortunate because the guy's brilliant, right? I mean, and you've been a friend with him for a long time, and people are very popular with his interviews. But there are these other factors that people should be aware of, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
At this point, my attitude has been, and in my last monologue about Jason, I think it's very important for people to be aware of what people like Jason are saying, because they're having an influence. But I don't encourage anybody to become a follower of that line of thought. the reason to be aware of it is to oppose it rather than to join in.
Excellent questions, guys. I'm going to ask you one of mine at the moment, if that's right, Jeffrey. I read your book about Ted Owens, the PK man. I'm not sure if everyone's read that book here, so it'd be great if we could get a bit of an overview on that from you, because I think that there's an amazing connection between humans that have great psi ability and I guess an ET UFO connection. You know, the guy in your book, Ted Owens, has this ability, but we also know that Uri Geller, for example, says that he has all his ability because he had a UFO encounter. And in fact, there are several books in the early days of Uri's career where it details quite a lot of UFO and alien kind of, I would say, interference in a way. So if you could outline the book and those experiences a bit, because I think that's really important to what we're doing with remote viewing, because no matter who we are as remote viewers, every time we're all targeted on projects like the moon and Mars and places like that, we all seem to report strange, what I would class as non-human artifacts.
Okay, well, it all started that very same occasion when I went to SRI International to visit Puthoff and Targ, and I did my first remote viewing experiment, because when I was there, they were all abuzz about this fellow Ted Owens, who had been writing to them. Back then, they had achieved some notoriety for their work with Uri Geller, and Ted Owens was badgering them, sending them letters constantly saying, in effect, why are you wasting your time with Uri Geller? Because I'm the world's greatest psychic. And to prove it to you, he said, I happen to know there's a drought going on right now, and this would be February 1976 in California. He said, I will use my powers of psychokinesis to end the drought. And you will know that I did it, because you will find every type of weather, sleet, hail, snow, power blackouts, lightning strikes, and especially UFO sightings, which is one of my trademarks. And the local newspaper will publish a story in the next few days saying the drought is over, which would have been amazing, because at the time, the papers were running stories saying no end in sight to the drought. And well, all that happened within like 3 days. The Palo Alto newspaper said, weird weather, UFO sightings, hail, sleet, snow, everything. And Puthoff and Targ were impressed. Targ wrote back to Owens and said, that was a great prediction, thank you. And Owens responded by basically saying, hell no, it wasn't a prediction, I caused it, with the help of the UFO aliens with whom I work. And at that point, because they were getting funding from the CIA, Puthoff and Targ were very eager to get this problem out of their office and out of their laboratory. They had enough problems with one controversial psychic, Uri Geller. They didn't need another. They wanted to be very low key. The CIA, they knew, would not be pleased with a publicity hound like Ted Owens, involving them. So they asked me if I would take all of their files on Ted Owens and do my own research on him, which I did. And 20 years later, the book got published. And the thing is that how can I put it? I'm still not sure, after decades of looking into this, what the heck was going on. Probably something that defies our normal human language. Was he using just precognition? Was it psychokinesis? And to what extent were aliens involved? I have good reason to think that it's some combination of all of that. And I did, extensive research with Ted Owens until he died in 1987. And it wasn't until 1999 that the book got published. And the reason is because for a long time, publishers wouldn't believe that it was a nonfiction book. Actually, Scott Rogo and I wrote the first draft of the manuscript back in about 1979. And the first publisher we showed it to rejected it because he said, this is a lousy work of fiction. They just couldn't see it as nonfiction. It's very bizarre and very hard for people to digest for that reason. And on top of that, there is a frightening aspect to the phenomenon, because Ted Owens was this larger than life figure who would like to brag about what he could do. And when, people don't like braggarts. So he would brag, the great PK man, I can do this and I can do that. And then people would say, oh, you're a liar. And he would then say, well, I guess I'll have to teach you a lesson. And the lessons were often very uncomfortable. People died sometimes. So for all of those reasons, it was very hard for people to approach that material. It still is, even today. I don't know if you want to go into it in greater depth than that, but the book is still available. There are probably 5 or 6 interviews on the New Thinking Aloud channel if you wanted to dig into it further.
Thanks for that. No, I think it's a very interesting topic, as I said, because I don't know hardly any remote viewers that don't encounter in some form or another these non-humans, and it looks like they are in control of some kind of physical stroke non-physical craft. And I think to be honest, over the last few years, because of the revelations of the New York Times articles and the Tic Tac Nimitz revelations, and the experiences of UFOs going back decades or even hundreds of years now that tally with psychic experiences, I think it's bringing a new era, I think, especially for ufology. Ufology used to be laughed at as a subject, and remote viewing used to be more prominent and more accepted. I think the tables over the last year or so have reversed, and remote viewing is less accepted now, and ufology is more accepted. But I do think that, as ufology becomes more accepted with these revelations, and I know there are more on the way, that psychic will be, and Psi will be dragged with it, because, the allegations are that the craft are, controlled by psychic means. When there's interactions between non-humans and humans, that always seems to be of a psychic nature as well. And it's just really interesting for me that the top Psi people, like Ted Baker and Uri, that seem to have some kind of really strong powers, also have these really strong ET connections. Have you experienced any other people, for example, that have had really strong ET connections? I mean, we know some, like Ingo has very strong ET connections, for example.
Well, another good example would be the people of the Skull group, who are now, they've relocated to Spain, but they, in the context of spiritualist mediumship, tell me they've encountered ETs who have materialized physically right there in their seances. So it's there's a strong overlap between the whole field of spiritualism and extraterrestrials going back to the 19th century, as a matter of fact.
Excellent. Christopher, you had your hand up just now. Did you want to ask a question, or is you off that one?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, let me see. Hey, Jeffrey, how you doing?
Hello.
So, yeah, I'm a fan of your show. I just had a quick question. I guess I know you've interviewed so many people, and I apologize if you got this question before, but is there anyone that really you spoke to that really just kind of maybe opened up your eyes in a different way, or kind of inspired you? kind of a big way in your life?
Well, yes, I usually, when people ask me that question, which is a question I get a lot, I say Jean Houston. She was a very big influence on my life, especially as I was first starting out in the field back in the 1970s. I regard her work as being first rate. She's still active. She's in her 80s now, and she's still offering workshops and training. And she's always been a huge inspiration to me.
I'll check that out then. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question in the chat window here, and this is from Jim. He says, I've seen some accounts that researchers who studied Uri Geller often experience hitchhiker effects, where paranormal occurrences happened in their home, e.g. poltergeists or discarnate voices and visions. Have you happened across any research or views on paranormal experiences having a contagion-like effect?
Well, back in the day when Uri Geller was in the public spotlight and doing many public appearances, there was a phenomenon in the parapsychology literature that they were called mini Gellers. Geller would get on TV and do spoon bending, and people in the radio or TV audiences would report that in their own homes, spoons and knives and forks are bending, and clocks that hadn't worked for years were suddenly starting to work, and other kinds of paranormal phenomena were occurring. This was reported widely, and back in those days, I was on the radio in KPFA in Berkeley, and we would have Uri come into the station and give interviews, and we get all kinds of calls from viewers who were reporting this, which suggests that whatever Uri was doing is a capacity that's latent within humanity, and sometimes just a simple demonstration on his part was enough to release it.
Yeah, I remember that happening in the UK quite a lot as well when he was on TV shows. It was always reported the next day in all the local papers, this clock started, this watch bent, and so on. Yeah. Excellent. We have a question from Pablo up next. Are you there, Pablo?
Sorry, I was talking on mute. Just quick question here. I think I've asked this in other calls, but probably it's not remote viewing, but it's more ESP related or PK related. But there have been many accounts, including Uri Geller. I have an unofficial account regarding Ingo, but people doing, what Ted Sirius was doing, using mind and projecting images into film. Have you heard anything about it, or have you had any personal account of that?
I have heard of other people doing it, but nothing much recently. Now that you mention it, all I can say is, there have been occasional reports. I do recall, now that you mention it, my friend Jim Hickman did an experiment with Uri using film and Kirlian photography, where Uri concentrated on having like a bolt of lightning come out of his fingertips, and they actually captured that using Kirlian photography process, or what they called at the time high voltage photography. But no, I don't know of any case comparable to that of Ted Sirius. He seems to be in a category all of his own.
Thank you very much for sharing that.
Excellent, guys. I have a question here from Eric in the chat. He says, you mentioned that when you were originally learning remote viewing, you were taken to a shielded room to reduce the potential for EM interference. I wonder if you have any thoughts or are aware of any promising research that shows how technology can be used to enhance psychic functioning.
It's a very good question. There have been, I'm sure you people are all aware of the work of James Spottiswoode with the local sidereal time. That would be one example, although as I recall, Spottiswoode is lately not so enthusiastic. He's always been wondering if the original report of 13 hours and 30 minutes local sidereal time might be an artifact. I'm inclined to think, though, that if it's not an artifact, it would be very similar to the reports of working in a shielded room, because the thinking at the time was that 13 hours and 30 minutes local sidereal time is when the center of the galaxy is on the opposite side of the Earth from where the viewer is. So perhaps the Earth itself is shielding the viewers from any interference that might be coming from positronic emissions at the center of the galaxy. There was also some very interesting research. I interviewed Charlie Tart about it. He did this study back in the 1960s where he was attempting to replicate some work originally done by Andrea Puharich using a Faraday cage, which is another form of electronic shielding. And the research is very technical, very complex. It has to do with the particular ways in which you ground the Faraday cage. It might even involve certain pulsing of the Faraday cage. But that work also seemed promising. I don't think it's been followed up on as a way to enhance extrasensory functioning. And there's some suggestions from Stuart Hameroff based on his research. Stuart Hameroff has a theory about how consciousness operates in the brain, involving the quantum mechanical tiny microtubules inside of the neurons, completely separate from the normal neural spikes that go on. And based on his theories, Hameroff is both developing scientific tests of the theory, and we should learn about that very soon, whether it's confirmed or refuted, but also some technological innovations, I think working with ultrasound. Now, I think his notion is to apply those to the treatment of Alzheimer's. I don't know that he's thinking at all about enhancing remote viewing, but there might be some potential applications there. There's an organization run by Jeffrey Martin, who is the person who has a program called the Finders Course, Achieving Higher States of Consciousness. He's affiliated with Sophia University in Palo Alto, California. And every year they have a big conference of the various companies that are engaged in building technologies for the purpose of enhancing consciousness functioning or brain functioning in one way or another. It's an up and coming field. I do have an interview on consciousness technologies with a woman, Nicole, I think it's Nicole Wallace, I believe, who organizes those conferences, but they have them on an annual basis. So there are always new developments, and there are probably well over 100 companies manufacturing all kinds of devices. Now that I think of it, another interview I did was with Eben Alexander, the fellow the near-death experiencer, whose new girlfriend, Karen Newell, owns one of these companies. It's called Sacred Acoustics, using the binaural beat technology to put people into deep meditative states. Of course, I'm sure most of you know the Monroe Institute works with that technology as well. So actually, I don't use very much of that technology myself, but I think it's always good to keep an eye on it. There could always be a major breakthrough.
Yeah, absolutely. On your video channel, you have a huge swathe of topics and subjects. I'm just interested in your thinking behind what research or have you seen or experienced or interviewed people about that you feel would show the best likelihood to be developed for human potential over the next, say, decade or so?
Well, I'm actually very fond of the work that John Knowles and Deborah have done in their new book on associative remote viewing and using remote viewing for financial forecasting. I think it's very exciting. It does seem to me, as I've been looking at progress in this field over the last 50 years, that there is some incremental progress. It may take a long time before it reaches industrial strength, but I think we're getting there.
Well, I have to agree with that because I've been, with NIAM here and a few others, I've been part of a company that's been selling predictive services to the cryptocurrency market for 4 years, and that's doing extremely well at the moment. So, yeah, I can concur with that one myself. I'm running out of questions in the chat window. Anita's got a question. If you'd like to go ahead, Anita.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Jeffrey. So, what parts of the brain do you think are involved with remote viewing? And are there parts such as the frontal lobe, which we all consider our enemy in remote viewing, the logic, which inhibit remote viewing? And which of the senses, as well as parts of the brain, do you think are having the intake of RV signal? And does that part then translate to other senses, such as, are we feeling the signal and therefore sometimes seeing and smelling and hearing? What do you think about that? What have you read?
Well, I'm not inclined to ask that question. I think, actually, I tend to think you're asking the wrong question, Anita. I could be wrong, of course, but my thinking is that the way I'm interpreting your question is that it's kind of a reductionistic question. You're looking at parts. What if I only knew what part of the brain, then I can somehow make that part work for me better, or if it's interfering, turn that part off. I tend to think more holistically. If you were to ask me, we have not discovered an organ of psychic perception, and I personally don't believe such an organ exists. The question almost implies that the mind exists within the brain, whereas from my point of view, the brain exists within the mind. So it's not as if the parts of the brain aren't important. I think they're very important, but I think when it comes to psychic perception or remote viewing, the entire body is involved. It's the whole of your psyche, and your body is in your psyche. So I don't know, that may not be a very satisfactory answer for you, but I kind of think that you'll get further by, turning your question inside out.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question, guys. I've run out of questions here in the chat window and in the hands up window if everyone's finished with your questions here tonight. No last questions from you guys?
Oh, no, I could ask some more questions.
Go ahead if you got something.
So I appreciate if you don't want to answer this question, Jeff, because maybe you don't want to pick favorites, but out of all of the remote viewers you've interviewed, who's your favorite?
Out of all the remote viewers, oh my gosh. That is a hard question to answer because everybody is so unique and everybody has wonderful stories. And I've experienced personally with remote viewers 100% accuracy on detailed, complex targets. So I think it's a capability that is surrounds us. It's all over. It's just largely unrecognized in our culture. I'm very fond of just about everybody in the psychic field. I have to tell you that. But if I had to name one name, I'll tell you who does come to mind is Lynn Buchanan. And I know people have their critique of Lynn, but I think he's turned 80 recently. He's been around from pretty close to the beginning of the field. He has a very big heart. He's the person who trained Laurie Williams, who's a great trainer as far as I can tell, and a great remote viewer. So I have, personally, I have a lot of positive feelings for Lynn, but I could say, usually when I do interviews, you got to appreciate that it's a very intimate, loving experience. And I try to approach each interview with an open heart. And so whoever I'm with at the moment is usually the best.
That leads very nicely onto my next two questions. The first of which is, how do you choose your guests?
How do I choose the guests?
Yeah.
Well, there are many different ways. Some of them come to me through their publicity agents. Some of them I reach out and discover because I've noticed that they've written a book or an article that I think is interesting. Many of them are old friends whom I've known for decades. Sometimes people reach out to me, people I've never heard of. James Tunney, who has become a regular guest on the program, sent me his books, and I read them and liked them and invited him to come to Albuquerque. So there isn't any one way.
And the next question, I think you answered beautifully already, which was, what makes you such a good interviewer? So no need to answer that one. I noticed John and Sasha have their hands up. So. Oh, before I go, I would like to take the only opportunity I will ever get in my life to say thank you for being with us, Jeff. It's been wonderful.
Well done.
Well, you know what? I'll answer the question you didn't really think you needed to ask, because there is a story behind it, now that I think about it. When I was 18 years old, I was a bellhop at a resort in Wisconsin. I was working for the summer. So I'm very young and very impressionable and, kind of an awkward teenager, basically, just out of high school. And one of the things I noticed at the time is that there was another fellow, a bellhop like myself, and he was just very, very popular. Everybody loved this guy. And I tried to figure out why. And one of the things I noticed was that when he was around people, he was always asking them questions. He showed a great interest in other people by asking them to talk about themselves. And I realized at a young age that that's a key to being popular. People love to have somebody take an interest in them. Whereas, a young, selfish teenager might not even think about it. But I think this bellhop, whose name I can't even remember, ultimately had a huge influence on me. So, learning to be a good listener is a great skill, and being willing to show a genuine interest in other people is an enormous skill that will take you very far in life.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for that, guys. Let's go with the last two questions, then we'll start with John, and then go with Sasha after.
Yeah, if I could say one thing about Anita's question, Jeff, you must be aware of this, that Gary Nolan and others have found not only physical structures in the brain that apparently are there only for people with extreme psi abilities, but also they're doing genetic research and have found some psi markers of that. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but just another quick ending is funding. There's so many billionaires around. Why can't we get funding for psi research? So I'll end it there. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Well, you asked two questions. To be honest, John, I haven't read any of that research. I've heard about it, and my first instinct is to be very skeptical of it, simply because it goes against my own preconceptions. I could be wrong. I should study it more carefully. But as I say, I don't think that that it's likely to pan out. I could be very wrong about it. And the second question was about funding. And my attitude has been not to apply for funding. I have, in my life, I have received over $1 million in funding. However, it was not because I reached out for it. It's because some funders reached out to me. And it just happened. And I've always taken the attitude that I can do what I want to do without funding, and or I can fund myself. And occasionally people have recognized that, what you're doing looks great and we'd like to help you. And I've been always open to that and happy for it. But in my experience, going out and beating the bushes to seek funding has been a fruitless and time-consuming effort that, I learned how to write proposals, and even really good proposals, but I often found that at the end of the day, the quality of your proposal seemed to mean a lot less than your political connections. So,
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Thanks for that one, guys. And Sasha, if you'd like to go with the last question.
Thank you. This ties into what you were just talking about a little bit. And it's kind of a twofold question. And again, I'm just talking it through. It's really pre-planned, so bear with me a little bit. So there are two things that I'm wanting to know about. Because you speak to so many people in the parapsychology field, and I mean, you get a certain access to the behind the scenes. I'm wondering if some of the inhibition of progress, let's say, in the development of Psi at a more mainstream level has to do with, one, maybe the view that this is something that's maybe a little bit too powerful in some ways, to be let loose on the masses. And I'm not saying that I have that view, but I'm wondering if some people who do have a bit of influence over what information gets out or what gets funded maybe have that view. And then in terms of, I guess this is kind of how I came to that question, because I look at, someone brought up Wilhelm Reich and his machines recently to me. So he was developing machines that did seem to operate in this kind of a domain, right? Tapping into things in our realm. And they burned it. Well, his laboratory was burned down. All his research was in it. It was all destroyed, and he was put in jail. And so, and I look, there's I think it's, what's it called? The Lakovsky device that also has some parallels with some of the research that's been done on what can enhance psi ability, let's say.
Did you say a Velikovsky device?
No, Lakovsky device.
Lakovsky.
Yeah, it had rings of different metals, and then electricity was passed through them, and then the experiencer sat in between the rings. And he also he's existing, he creates this device, it starts having amazing results, and then he disappears, and his machines just get put in a basement and they gather dust and nothing further comes of it, right? And so I'm wondering, is it that people develop these things and then they themselves are part of the secrecy because they want to patent it or they want to make money from it, and so they keep it secret so that information doesn't come out, but then it's not really a viable business idea because Psi isn't mainstream yet, so then it just kind of goes nowhere? Or is it that there are maybe forces in place that are acting to prevent kind of the proliferation of these types of devices into the mainstream?
Well, it's a very complex question you're asking.
Yeah, I know, sorry.
It's all right. If I had to pick a single force contributing to the suppression of, let's just stick to the parapsychology side of it, of psychic functioning, I would say it's our own subconscious mind. It's not done consciously by the people who do it. If you ask all the skeptics, they're not consciously believers in parapsychology who are trying to suppress it. They honestly believe that it doesn't exist. I think they're quite sincere about that, but they don't have any appreciation for the subconscious dynamics underlying their own belief. But the most insightful description of what's really going on here, I had back in the days when I was a college student, and Arthur C. Clarke came to speak at Berkeley in the 1970s, a great science fiction writer who had recently published an article that was in Time magazine criticizing Uri Geller. So I raised my hand in the audience. I said, Mr. Clarke, do you believe in ESP? Because if you read his novels, they're full of it, like Childhood's End. And he said something that I will never forget. He was very clear. He said, no, I don't believe in ESP because I don't want anybody to read my mind.
Yeah.
That is such a profound statement. It would take a long time to unpack. But consider this, Sigmund Freud, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, if I had to name 5 outstanding thinkers of the 20th century, Freud would be on the list, pointed out his great insight is that we don't even want to know what's in our own mind. The whole Freudian subconscious is filled with aspects about ourselves that are considered unacceptable in civilized society. So we push them out of our awareness through a defense mechanism known as repression. So if we don't want to know what's in our own mind, how can we possibly tolerate the idea that another person, a psychic person, could do that, could see things about us that we don't even want to see? That's, to me, the fundamental dynamic that's going on. And in order to overcome that dynamic, we have to have a society that's more spiritually evolved. We have to have a society of people who are at least willing to break through the Freudian subconscious and be aware of, the things that we have been taught from childhood to repress in our own consciousness.
I wonder if that has a little bit to do as well with not just this idea of the materialist versus the more spiritually inclined, but I really think it has to do with a division between information processing and meaning processing. And I think maybe these people are processing information as a priority rather than meaning. And so earlier I was talking about the cocktail party effect. And so if they are functioning in a mode where they're prioritizing information over meaning, then they're not processing meaning at that low filter level, right? And so then they're not going to hear the equivalent of their name being said in a busy room to draw their attention, because they're not processing meaning. They're only processing information. And I think most remote viewers know that you're getting meaning in some ways differently than just the information, right? So you got the overpass, but it ended up being, what was it, a garment rack, a clothing rack? So you're not, I don't know that their method of information acquisition is actually suitable to having these remote viewing experiences, having access to that information. So maybe that adds to their skepticism because they're prioritizing information over meaning. And so I think that maybe that's what has to change in our culture, is that we've started putting all our emphasis on information. Because that's what our machines that we're currently using do best and only do, right? And so I think maybe that's an easier shift to bring about in society, would be to shift people from information to meaning. I think it'll be a lot harder to shift people from materialist reductionism to spirituality. So it might be an avenue of, I guess, worth investigating to see if we can kind of push things a little bit more in that sense, maybe. I don't know.
That's a very good point. It would make a great doctoral dissertation to look into that. If you're a psychologist, I think it'd be a wonderful topic. I did do an interview decades ago with Theodore Roszak, the sociologist, who had written a book called The Cult of Information, about how our whole society is infected by this, that we have lost track of the difference between information, knowledge, and wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. I think we should leave it there because we've kept Jeffrey for 2 hours now. And on behalf of everyone here, Jeffrey, I just want to say thank you for your videos and thank you for spending these 2 hours sharing your experience and knowledge with us. It's been much appreciated.
My pleasure.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. What I'll do is I'll put the video of this up as soon as possible for you to review it again. Again, thank you for all for joining us and for you guys for asking your interesting questions as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. That really was amazing.
Thank you so much.
Very much appreciated.
Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Wonderful. I hope you come back again.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
Come
you.
back.
Good night.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.